Hello, happy Tuesday afternoon. I hope you have had a great day. It's been an amazing week here at the clinic. Just been pretty weather and having fun helping people get healthier. You know what I just noticed standing here right before we went online? If you look behind me, that beautiful picture, it was taken in Hawaii when my husband and I went on our 20-year anniversary. That looks like I have a halo over my head. So I guess I'm a little bit of an angelic person. One day I'll get a better setup, but it's this light that's supposed to help me have less fine lines and wrinkles and give me better color, but it reflects into that picture. And so maybe one day I'll have a different setup. Until then, you'll just see a reflection of an angel back there. So in the middle of all my chaos, running DMA Weight and Wellness, starting up Clear Path Medical, I decided it was this amazing idea to essentially go back to school. In reality, I signed up for this certification course about a year ago, and the timing just happened to line up, and I didn't want to miss this opportunity. Plus, I'd already paid for it to get this certification course, but it's essentially a collegiate level course. So I've been out of school for over 20 years. I've written my first 2 papers in over 20 years just in the last couple of weeks, dusting off the cobwebs on that part of my brain, stepping out of the provider role, moving into more of a scientific writing platform. But because I've got all this going on, over the next couple of weeks on our lives, you're going to be learning what I'm learning and what I'm talking about in those classes. And this week we were talking about insulin resistance, which is something we've talked about quite often here in our spaces, but also with my clients here in the clinic. But my particular area this week to look at was the hormone insulin and high blood pressure. So a couple of weeks ago, we did a live just talking about what is insulin, should you have it checked, why is it important? And the answer to that was overwhelmingly yes, you should have it checked. And it's a pretty easy test. And even if your provider who you see doesn't want to order it, it's not that expensive of a test to get on your own at a place called Own Your Own Labs and have your blood taken. Or if you're seeing me, I'm happy to draw it for you anytime. But today it's taking it a step further. This condition, hypertension. Hypertension is a very important condition. It's a very big risk factor for heart disease. And heart disease is one of the #1 killers here in America and around the world. And there's been this known correlation between obesity and high blood pressure and obesity and heart disease. And we also noticed that people with type 2 diabetes had a higher correlation with blood pressure. Well, in type 2 diabetes, you're essentially insulin resistant, meaning you make enough insulin, you actually overproduce insulin, your body just doesn't know what to do with it, doesn't act with it appropriately. So there was this idea of, well, what if hypertension, which often precedes or comes before the high blood sugar, is actually a part of this cascade, this insulin resistance type thing. And there's been several studies that have looked at this. Notably, one of the first was Gerald Reaven, and his study was done, oh goodness, back in the 80s, that highly correlated insulin and high blood pressure before high blood pressure or before high blood sugar even comes into the picture. And it made me wonder, when I read that study, it's like, why in the world, if we knew back in the 80s that insulin was one of the potential big drivers, why can't we come out and say, let's work on that instead of focusing on something else that doesn't seem to be the big driver, essentially dietary fat and even salt. Now, let me preface this by saying salt in particular is a very controversial thing. Fat is still very controversial. Insulin is still controversial. But what we don't realize, or what most people don't realize, is your body's meant to have salt. It's designed to have salt to keep a nice, wonderful balance going on. Well, when we adapt a standard American diet or a diet that is high in carbohydrate and high in fat, your body no longer keeps that good balance because you have insulin receptors all throughout your body, including on a very vital organ, which is your kidneys, which is one of the things we're going to talk about today. But when those receptors are filled, your body doesn't filter that salt the way it once did, and it holds on to it, and water volume salt and bigger volume, bigger blood pressure, but it's not that quite easy. But let's take a step back. So there are 3 mechanisms in which this hormone insulin can drive high blood pressure, and this is before your blood sugar ever goes crazy. The first is the sympathetic nervous system. Now, the sympathetic nervous system is responsible for a whole lot of things, but one of those is your metabolism, or a process called thermogenesis, so your rate at which you're breaking down items. Your dietary intake greatly stimulates the sympathetic nervous system. Insulin is one of the main modulators or controllers or responding to whatever your dietary intake is. we know that if you overfeed, either in general or if you're overfeeding in carbohydrates, you're going to require more insulin to break down that food that you're eating. Well, what happens is that insulin stimulates the sympathetic nervous system to create catecholamines. Now, catecholamines are a big word, but just think of this as catecholamines kind of set things on fire. It basically speeds your metabolism. It revs it up so that it creates that energy balance again, so that you don't have too much sugar, too much stuff floating around your blood system, and it's burned up most of that. That's all fine and good. And it's a good thing to have happen, but catecholamines don't just act to increase thermogenesis. They also act on the heart, they act on the lungs, they act on the kidneys, they act on multiple parts of the brain. And when they act on those, they're stimulating those. So if you're stimulating the heart and the blood vessels and the kidneys, guess what? You're going to cause vasoconstriction and elevated blood pressure. So insulin responded to your food to create your sympathetic nervous system to make catecholamines, which then raised your blood pressure. So follow me here. Remove the insulin because you didn't stimulate it with food and specifically carbohydrate. You're not overstimulating catecholamines, therefore your blood pressure can lower. So that's one mechanism. The next mechanism is through that sodium reabsorption that I alluded to earlier. So insulin, that beautiful hormone, acts in a part of your kidneys that are called the proximal renal tubules. Is that important for you to know? No, it is not important for you to know. The main thing that's important for you to know is that insulin acts on your kidneys. So when it acts on those kidneys, it increases sodium reabsorption. So those insulin receptors, insulin acts on the kidneys in that proximal renal tubule, and sodium's reabsorbed. Well, if you go back to your middle school science class, you know that water follows salt or sodium. Well, if your body's absorbing more sodium, it's also going to reabsorb more water. If you imagine your blood vessels being like a hose pipe, what happens when you turn up the faucet and have a higher volume? Well, it elutes more pressure on them. Okay, your body works the same way. You put more pressure inside your blood vessels, more pressure is on them, thus high blood pressure. So if you remove the insulin stimulus, your kidneys filter the sodium like they're supposed to. In fact, you actually need more sodium when you're on a carbohydrate restricted diet because you're filtering it out quite well, and your blood pressure goes down. There's been this new class of drugs that's come out in the last couple of years. It's SGLT2 inhibitors. You don't need to know those. They're not important, but they're being pushed right now for high blood pressure, for heart disease, for renal protection, and for diabetes, because how they work is they make you put more sugar out in your urine. Well, insulin comes into play as this as well, and I might have to read off my notes here to get it all straight. So basically, when SGLT2 is operating appropriately, when your blood sugar goes high, it's spilled over into the urine after a certain level. Well, SGLT2 increases the reabsorption of glucose and sodium back in. Well, how those medicines work is they block that reabsorption of SGLT2, so you're forcing out the sodium and the blood sugar into your urine, thus lowering your blood sugar. Well, what if you just don't stimulate that at all? You're not stimulating the SGLT2 inhibitor or the SGLT2 site, transporter site, to reabsorb that glucose and that sodium by not using insulin, because insulin stimulates the SGLT2. The SGLT2 makes you put glucose and sugar back in, glucose, sugar, and salt back in your system. Water follows that, more volume. Here you go, higher blood pressure. So we can essentially do something that a medication does just by changing what you're eating. Save yourself a lot of money, save yourself a lot of side effects, because the side effects of those drugs are things like chronic yeast infection, external genital rot. Yeah, that sounds so pleasant. And the yeast infections is the main ones that people get. And I also know people just feel rough on them. Now, if you're eating the standard American diet, they're one of those standard American pills that I'm probably going to have to prescribe you to control your blood sugar and to help protect your kidneys. And we use them all the time when people are not ready to make those dietary changes. So the last mechanism, the third one, is endothelial damage. So your endothelial is the cells that line the walls and make up the walls of your blood vessels, okay? This is another one that you're going to have to follow me along with. So this damage comes from multiple places, but it all starts with a process called glycation. Another big word. Is it important to you? No, but know that what glycation is the normal thing that happens to where your body helps to break down and take care of nutrients like sugar. So insulin is a hormone that glycation acts on. So when insulin is glycated, bad things happen. Downstream effects happen. Now, your body can clear a certain amount of glycation, but when it has too much of that insulin and it's having to overglycate it to take care of the balance that's going on in the system, you get an inflammatory response that puts things out called reactive oxygen species, and it increases oxygenated stress, and it activates this system that's called the age-rage system. Do you need to know any of that? No, but age rage sounds bad, right? I think it sounds bad. It sounds like something horrible is happening in your system. And that's essentially what's happening. The inflammation, you're going into inflammation overload. And you've reached a point to where your body can no longer clear that glycated insulin that's trying to take care of all the sugar that you ate. And it causes damage. The reactive oxygen species go in and change the DNA, change the makeup of the cells, cause damage to the walls. Then your cholesterol comes in and builds up plaque, and you get thinner vessels for blood to go through, raising that pressure even more. Also, when your vessels are damaged, they're stiff. They no longer respond to the changes in pressure, and therefore you get high blood pressure. Well, if you don't eat the carbs to need the insulin, you don't have all this advanced glycation, and then you don't get the reactive oxygen species. You don't get all this breakdown. You don't get the blood vessel damage that's there. So it's a lot about prevention. You may be wondering, well, can I get rid of it after I've done it? So after I've started these processes, after I've got endothelial damage, after I've already stimulated the kidneys too much, can I get it gone? And the answer is yes, to some extent, most of the time. So I have had patients in my office with moderate renal failure caused by high blood pressure and all of these things that we just talked about, that I've put them on a very carb restricted diet. And within months, their renal functions improve, which is amazing. Something they told that they could never, ever do. And they did it with dietary changes alone. But just if you use dietary changes to heal your body, I don't want you to think that you're healed and they go away. You've moved that condition outside of the door, but as soon as you open the door and start eating back to that standard American diet, that condition can step right back in because you're already predisposed to it. Now, when it comes to endothelial damage and damage to the blood vessels, some of it can be reversed, some of it can't be reversed. You reach a point to where the vessels are just stiff, but we can still stop the damage where it is and hold it steady and improve your overall health. But the moral of the story is we've been chasing some wrong things when it comes to hypertension. We've been chasing salt and fat. And I will say that fat and salt in combination with carb is a bad combination that has probably got us to where we are. But in my opinion, it is the fat, salt, and carbohydrate together, or even the carb and the salt together. It's not the fat and it's not the salt by themselves. These are things that we were meant to have. We have to have salt to live. We actually have to have fat to live because of the essential fatty acids that are in them. We don't have to have carbs. And our insulin will be a nice steady state and not cause all of these inflammatory changes if we control our diet. All right, so that's what I have for today. I hope you've enjoyed my little science lesson that I went through. I did list all of my references. You may not want to look at all of those references. There's one in particular that might be interesting then, number 7. It's a paper put out by David Unwin, and he's a primary care doctor in England. And he's actually showing how making carb restriction in a primary care practice, it overall improves specifically blood pressure. So it is real world data. It's not paid for by a pharmaceutical company. It is not paid for by anyone. It was just him collecting data in his clinic and then publishing it. So you know it's truthful stuff. Nothing's been tried to be hidden or under the rug that's there. Who knows what we'll talk about next week? It may still be on the high blood pressure side of things. I may pull from one of the other questions in the people in my group, but we're going to keep learning. So keep watching out for changes with ClearPath Medical. If you're interested in finding out more information and knowing, being among the first to know pricing and different things that we're offering, make sure to email us at contact@clearpathmedical.net. That change is not happening until January 1st. So if you're one of my current patients, nothing's changing until January 1st. If you're one of the people hoping hoping to get on at Clear Path Medical and you've not seen me under DMA Weight and Wellness, send me an email. We'll be accepting a few people before then, but just maybe some test subjects, but we're going full force in January, and we'll be scheduling heavily for that in November and December. So you guys have a great week. Stay well, stay healthy, and I'll see you next time.